So we started these public lectures probably about 20 years ago. We had a little bit of hiatus because of Hurricane Harvey. How many of you were here 10 years ago? Wow. 15? Wow, that's great. So those of you who have been here for a long time have already heard me talk about seals, right? Yet you came back. Okay, well, I do have new stuff to report. And so this will be different. I saw that many of you are watching the video instead of watching the fish. That's good. That means you like what I'm going to talk about. So let me get on with it. We've been working in Antarctica for about the past 20 years, trying to study the habits of Weddell seals. This is an animal that I'll be talking about today. It's a very convenient animal to work with. Very peaceful, docile animals, although quite large. And for most of our work, we've been studying the feeding behavior and the hunting behavior of these animals. But what I want to talk to you about is something different today. I want to talk to you about their homing abilities or their navigational abilities. That is, how do they find their way underwater? Okay, so first let me give you a little bit of background about Antarctica. How many of you have been to Antarctica? Okay, a few. How many have actually set foot on it? Okay, that's a fewer, because a lot of people go on cruises, right? Okay, how many of you have been to Minnesota in the wintertime? Yeah, that's what I figured. It's pretty much the same thing, right? So Antarctica is really a continent of extremes. Here it is at the south end of the planet. So I'm not talking about the Arctic. I'm not talking about the North Pole. I'm talking about the South Pole, and the South Pole is roughly about there. Okay. So we're at the bottom of the world, and it has a lot of characteristics that make it really special or very different from the rest of the world. Like, it's the coldest place on Earth, with the possible exception of Mount Washington last week. Temperatures on the East Arctic Plateau can be below 130 degrees, and it's so cold that that's where they invented the idea of the wind chill factor. It's also the driest place on Earth. You might not have expected this, but there's very little precipitation there. A lot of snow, but it hangs around for a really long time. In fact, there's about as much precipitation there as there is in the Sahara Desert, which makes it one of the driest places on Earth and the largest desert on Earth. Also, there's a lot of wind there. It's the windiest place on Earth, and a famous Australian explorer from the heroic age of Antarctic exploration in the early 20th century, Sir Douglas Mawson, has this wonderful phrase: "The climate proved little more than one continuous blizzard year-round, a hurricane wind roaring for weeks together, pausing for breath at only odd hours." It's also the bottom of the world, so you have to hang on. And it's also a very high elevation place. So underneath the ice cap of the Antarctic is the land, and there are mountain ranges there. The average elevation of the land underneath the ice is about 8,000 feet. The highest point under the ice cap about 13,500 feet, but you've got 8,000 to 11,000 feet thick ice on top of that. So there's very high elevation, especially at the South Pole. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about Antarctica in the big picture is that it's surrounded by ice. The sea around it is so cold that it freezes solid. And the amount of sea ice that there is depends on the time of year. In the summertime, there's only about 1 million square miles of Antarctica if you include the ice that's on land plus the ice that's on the water, the sea ice. But in the wintertime, it gets so cold that the sea ice grows and grows, so that the size of the continent increases 8-fold. So there's 8 million square miles of Antarctica in the wintertime, and much less in the summertime. And this is really important for people studying things like Weddell seals, because they are semi-terrestrial, semi-aquatic organisms, and the amount of territory that's available to them will change with the seasons, okay? So that's one of the reasons that it's really interesting to study these animals in this particular location. So this is what the sea ice looks like from on it. Off in the distance, you see this mountain. That is Mount Erebus. It's an active volcano on Ross Island, which is the closest land that we are when we're working. And you'll see a few dark spots on the horizon there. Those are small islands. And all of the vast expanse in front of you is the frozen ocean. And off to the left, it extends for about 50 or 60 miles before you hit the Antarctic continent. So it's a very, very broad ice shelf. We're standing on top of about 2 to 3 to 4 feet of snow. And underneath that 2 to 4 feet of snow is between, about 6 and 10 or 15 feet of solid ice. So that's the environment that we're living on. And that's the environment where the Weddell seal lives. Now you might ask, why is a Weddell seal living there? Well, it's really safe environment for it because its predator, its main predator, is the orca or the killer whale. Orcas also have to breathe air, but they have such big bodies, big heads, and they need a very large open space to get up to breathe air. But Weddell seals have small noses and small heads, and they only need little cracks to stick their nose up in order to breathe. And what happens on this sea ice, which extends from shore to shore, is cracks form. Why do cracks form? Because the sea ice is floating on top of the ocean and the ocean has tides. So the ice is going up and down. But the land is not going up and down. So where the ice and the land meet, cracks form. And that opens up possibilities for seals to put their nose up and breathe. Okay, and they can actually increase the size of those cracks so they can actually get out of the water. So they can make a home there and they're away from their predators. Okay. If we look a little bit closer, here's what happens when the ice is near the shore. Here's the shoreline and the sea ice, and around the periphery of the island, you can't see any cracks here because they're covered with snow, but you see these little bumps here. Those little bumps are seals. If you see a seal near the edge of land like that, you know there's a hole somewhere that they go down into the water and they come out, right? That's because of the cracks that are formed by the tide going up and down and breaking the fastened ice from the shore. So the animal we're working with, here it is, the Weddell seal. It's an air-breathing mammal. It's warm-blooded. It weighs between 800 and 1,000 pounds for a large adult. And they're highly adapted to living in this environment. And here's one of them that's getting into, you'll see on the left side here, there's one getting into a hole in the ice that's formed by one of these tidal cracks. So that's about the size, a big hole. That's a big one for them to get into, get in and out of. And sometimes I'm amazed that they can squeeze that big fat body into that little hole. Okay, so they're really, really good divers. Here's one that's taking off from a hole. They routinely will dive for 20 to 25 minutes. They spend about 90% of their active life underwater. The time they're on land, they're basically sleeping. They don't do much else on land. And when they're in water, they're mating, but more importantly, they're feeding. And they're moving from place to place. The maximum dive that we have recorded in our studies is about 82 minutes. Now think about it, holding your breath for 82 minutes. Not just holding your breath, but swimming while you're doing it. It's really quite amazing. They can go very deep as well, so they can withstand the pressure of very deep water. Where we work in McMurdo Sound, the depth of the water is about 2,300 feet. You know, that's really deep. And these seals can go down there, look around the bottom like you saw on the video, and then swim back up to the top all in 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And they also can swim pretty fast. Now, I say they swim 7 to 10 miles an hour with a peak speed of 15 miles an hour. That may not sound very fast to you when you're driving in your car, but the fastest swimming speed ever recorded for a human is 5 miles an hour. So they're moving pretty well underwater. So our research, whether we were studying the feeding behavior of these animals or whether we are studying navigation, is relying on special equipment that we designed, built, and tested. It's basically an instrument that records data and video, and it's in its current generation in a very small package. This is the current generation. It's about the size of a big fist. You can see it next to a pen. And what it does is it collects data on board, and then we can retrieve the data and make something out of it, which I'll show you in a moment. But the sensors that we have on it will collect pressure, which is telling us how deep the animal is at any given time, the swimming speed of the animal, its accelerations, and accelerations due to gravity as well. So we can tell whether the animal's turning on its side or tilting up or tilting down. Much like your cell phone does the same thing. When you turn your cell phone sideways and the picture rotates, it's because the accelerometer is telling it that you've turned it sideways. It's taking the gravitational field into account. It also has a geomagnetic sensor on it, so we can figure out which direction the animals are swimming. It measures water temperature, it measures salinity of the water, and also measures light intensity. So we can collect all sorts of information about where the animal is, and it collects all of this data every second. So when an animal's diving for 20 minutes, we have 20 times 60 data points, right? 20 minutes times 60 seconds. So that's a lot of data for one dive. And then we also can use video. So you'll see a video camera on the front of a video lens on the front of the instrument. And around the side, you probably can't see it, are LEDs, little light emitting diodes. And they are in a special frequency or a wavelength of infrared light. The reason that's important is the camera can see infrared light. Humans can't see infrared light. Seals can't see infrared light. So these animals are swimming around with a spotlight that they can't see because we don't want to change their behavior, but our camera can see. So all that video you saw, especially when the animals were at the bottom about 1,000 feet below the surface, you saw all these things illuminated by light that was invisible. Okay. So what can we do with all the data that I just told you we collect? We do something called dead reckoning, an old navigation tool to chart a course. So if we know the speed, distance, and time, we can calculate an animal's position from its last position. And from it, we can calculate what we call a three-dimensional dive path. So this is an example of a single dive by a Weddell seal. And it shows you the location in 3 dimensions of where the animal was for every second during that dive. The numbers that I put along the dive are the minutes into the dive. So you can see here is the end of the first minute, the end of the second minute, 7 minutes, 9 minutes, and this is about a 10-minute and 15-second dive. The colors represent how fast the seal is swimming at those times. So already we know an awful lot about what happened during this dive, but with the seal. We know where he went, we know how fast he went, and we know lots of detail about it. We also have the video. So if we saw something really interesting on the video, say, for instance, where that star is at 7 minutes, we could then match up what we saw on the video with what happened before it and after it. So we can make inferences about what the behavior of the animal is regarding that object of interest on the video. So here's an example of some video. And something interesting happens. You see, he just caught something in the water. And here's another one. Okay? Well, what he's catching are these fish. They're called Antarctic silverfish. Now, we didn't know very much about Antarctic silverfish because it's hard for humans to catch them. But when we reconstructed the dive path of these animals, we can see all the behavior that leads up to it. And the first thing that we can see, let me just point out that it should be clear, but here's a picture from the video, and that happens at every one of these black points. So during this dive, the seal caught a lot of these silverfish, and they caught them close together. So from this, we have reported that this fish lives in schools. We didn't know that before. We also reported that this fish lives at a depth of about 300 meters or about 1,000 feet. Right? So we can see the depth where that happens. We didn't know that before. So we had the seal do our science for us. We also learned from a lot of these dives that this particular species of fish living in schools at about 300 meters moves up and down with the daytime. So when it's brighter outside, they go deeper. When it's brighter on the surface, they go deeper. When it's darker, like at nighttime, they come up shallower. And so we described the migratory behavior of this fish species from the data we collected from the seals. So after looking at hundreds, maybe even thousands of dives, I started to see something interesting. This is an overhead view of one dive, not a three-dimensional view, but an aerial view. So we're looking down on the top of the dive. We've got the breathing hole with the red star, and then we have something we call the far point. That's the farthest. That's the point that the seal is farthest from the breathing hole before it turns around and comes back. That's just a convenient way of dividing the dive into 2 portions, an outbound leg and an inbound leg. And what I saw was really interesting in this particular dive, and many others, by the way, is right here. You'll notice after the far point, the return is incredibly straight, like a beeline back to the hole. Yet the animal, I don't have a scale on here, but the seal was probably a half a mile away. So he swam an incredibly straight line for a half a mile in deep water with ice and snow over top. So what the heck is it using to guide itself along a straight path? And that's the question that we wanted to address. How do these animals navigate underwater, under snow, under ice, and oftentimes in the winter in darkness? Something else that's interesting on this particular dive is this sort of jagged set of tracks in this little range here. And you're going to see later on that will become something worth looking at. So we have this question. The question is, how do seals find their way? I don't know where to move this. How do seals find their way underwater when we think it's a featureless environment? So we went to the scientific literature to look at the way other animals find their way. And we wanted to find hypotheses. We wanted ideas about how they might do it, given the circumstances that we see them doing it. We see them doing it under snow and ice in very dark conditions when the environment doesn't have anything. It's just water, right? And ice overhead. And we wanted to come up, and they do it in the wintertime when there's no light at all. They do it at nighttime. So we wanted to figure out some hypothesis, some guesses at how they might do this. So we looked in the literature and we found the top candidate for this would be geomagnetic navigation. That is, if seals could sense the Earth's magnetic field and use that to navigate by, then they could do that regardless of the light conditions. They could do that under any conditions because the Earth's magnetic field, at least within the span of a dive or within their lifetime, is not going to change very much. We know from lots of experiments on sea turtles and spiny lobster and salmon that those animals definitely do have the ability to use the Earth's magnetic field to find their way. Marvelous experiments. And in these experiments, these animals are put into situations where the Earth's magnetic field around them is changed through a set of wires and so forth, and electricity. You can change the magnetic field without actually moving the animal. So you're simulating moving the animal to another location, and you see how it responds. And in those experiments, the animals respond as if they were in that other location. They swim in a different direction than they would if you had a different magnetic field around them. There's also some indication that some sharks and some homing pigeons might use the magnetic field in a different way to navigate. All of these geomagnetic hypotheses require that the animals have a sense, that are able to sense the magnetic field of the Earth. That has not been demonstrated for any mammal whatsoever. So we were very excited that this might be the answer, and we'd be the first people to demonstrate that seals or any marine mammal has a magnetic sense. And so we designed an experiment to test that hypothesis. So this is the unusual way that pigeons appear to be using the magnetic field. Here in these panels are a bunch of flight paths of homing pigeons after they've been released at some distant location from their roost. And in the early phases of that release, they undergo some squiggles or jagged paths in their flight, as you see shown here. If you take a closer look at those jagged paths, you start to see these 90-degree turns as shown by the white arrows here. You see this white arrow here and this white arrow here, and there's a little 90-degree turn there. Here's a 90-degree turn and another 90-degree turn, and then here's 3 90-degree turns. So these sharp right angle turns followed by straight paths of flight. And on top of that, those flight paths seem to be aligned with the magnetic field at those locations. So these dim green lines on here are the Earth's magnetic field at the locations. And you can see, for instance, here, that the field lines are here and here. And this path is parallel to those lines. This is perpendicular and this is parallel. Same thing with all these other ones. So the scientists who came up with this felt that the animals, the pigeons, were calibrating their internal compass by flying along the magnetic lines and then perpendicular to magnetic lines and using that information to say, aha, now I know where I am, and I know where I need to go, so I'm off. And the pigeons will go back to their roost. So this is going to be very important because we're going to use this hypothesis to test whether the seals are doing the same. And if you remember, I showed that jagged path on that previous slide. The magnetic contours are shown there. And now if you zoom in on that jagged path in the upper corner here, you'll see those jagged paths with these sort of red lines drawn through them to get an average direction there are kind of, if you squint your eyes a little bit and turn your head, you could say, it does look like they might be 90-degree turns and aligned with the magnetic field lines. But that's what we want to test. So what about other hypotheses? We don't want to just go out with only one hypothesis, because if it's wrong, then all you can say is we didn't find what we hoped to find. We wanted to increase our chances of answering the question of how seals find their way. So another hypothesis for navigation of animals is path integration. Now, path integration has been demonstrated in ants, in bees, in hamsters, and a few other animals. And under path integration, the idea is that the animals will keep track of the direction and distance that they're moving in different portions of their journey outbound. And then when they're ready to come home, they've averaged all of that up, and they take the average path in the opposite direction. So for instance, you see this ant here. It's crawling along an outbound path like this. And all along the way, in theory, it's averaging its distance and its direction. And when it gets to this point and it wants to go home, it just takes the average path and goes backwards and goes a straight line back to the nest. The way the scientists test this is by yet another version of the displacement experiment. Remember, I told you the navigation experiments are done by displacing animals. You can either simulate a displacement like with magnetic coils, or you can actually take a homing pigeon away and displace them and have them go home. Well, in this case, they take the ants after they've reached this point and displace them over here, and they release them, and they end up going straight back to where they think the nest is, but it's not there, so then they have to search for it. That straight line path back to home is indication of path integration. That's not the only solution that will give you path integration, but it's one of them. Another more familiar method of navigating is piloting. It's what we do, right? If we're out in a boat, a ship is navigating by a buoy, or it's navigating by a lighthouse. We're navigating by street signs. We're using fixed points of reference. We call them landmarks. They don't necessarily have to be visual. It could be auditory if something is moving toward or away from a sound. It could be the smell of something, but it's something that's in a fixed location that's reliable and that can navigate off of that, right? Now, we have a lot of ways of testing piloting. We would expect that an animal that is displaced would have to learn the landmarks in its current location, and that would take some time before it could do a long distance transit and then come back, right? It has to learn the local landmark. So there should be some kind of learning period. And for a seal that's transplanted or displaced, that learning period would be a period when they're doing short dives in order to find the local landmarks. We would also expect that after that short period of time, they would start to do longer and longer dives, progressively longer dives, because they're learning landmarks that are further and further away from home. So it makes sense, right? Also, when they turn around to come home, their inbound paths should converge on a small number of paths. So they could stray in almost any direction, but since the landmarks are in particular locations, their return journey should all converge on a few paths that lead to home, because that's where the landmarks are. And there's another possibility, that is, they won't go directly home from the end of their dive, from the far point, but they will go to a near landmark and then turn and go toward home. Okay, all of this is possible. So these are things that we could look for when we do our experiments. The final hypothesis that we want to test is nothing that anybody has ever suggested before, But we decided to suggest it because we learned something really interesting about seals. Now, these were not Weddell seals, they were other seals, but there's no reason to believe that it doesn't happen with Weddell seals. And that is, seals have these whiskers, really big, long whiskers. And some marvelous experiments done by some scientists in Germany about 10 years ago demonstrated unequivocally that these seals can use those whiskers to sense small movements in the water. So what's creating small movements in the water? Anything that moves through water. Fish, right? So if a fish swims through the water, it creates a wake. That wake is water movement. If a seal then swims after a fish has gone through an area, as long as it's not too long afterward, that water will still be moving because the water has momentum. And if the seal's whiskers can sense that water movement, they'll know that a fish has been here. So using that wonderful research that scientists in Germany did, we said, aha, what happens if the seal goes outbound, goes to the far point, and turns around and senses his own wake? He could just follow his own wake back in the direction of home. Now, in Antarctica, where the water is really cold and there's not a lot of current down there, the wake that an animal creates can last up to 3 or 4 minutes at levels that should be measurable by the seals. So they should have 3 or 4 minutes worth of a trail that they can follow. That seemed like it made good sense. So that became one of our hypotheses. And so if the seals were doing this, we would expect that when they turned around at the far point, they would do a hairpin turn and go back the same path that they went out on. So those are our hypotheses, and those are what we would look for in the data. So how are we going to do this? We do displacement experiments where we capture a seal, put the instrument on him, put him in another location he's never been before, record the data, and when we put him in that location, he will be going to and from that location. It's called the isolated hole protocol. So we create a hole in the middle of the ice that's not near anywhere else. The seal cannot breathe anywhere but the hole that we put him in. And so he's going to spend 3 days or so in that hole, doing whatever he wants to do, swimming and coming back, but always coming back to the same hole. And we're going to look at the characteristics of those dives. And because we want to study the magnetic navigation, we want those holes to be in places where the Earth's magnetic field is different from one another, so that the behavior in one hole should be different from the behavior in another hole and should be different from the behavior in another hole. And so this map, this is a satellite map of the area of Antarctica where we were working. And we, the home base is down here, McMurdo Station, Antarctica. And we worked out here in the sea ice. Now, I'm going to explain to you why we chose this particular location. Firstly, the seals are located naturally along the shorelines, as I told you, because that's where the tide raises the ice from the shoreline and creates cracks where they can breathe. So we needed to move out into the ice, into the sound, farther out away from shore, so they couldn't get away. The first thing we have to do is map the magnetic field in order to find 3 places that have different magnetic fields. And so we take this magnetometer. It's designed to be a backpack magnetometer, but we had hundreds of miles of survey to do. And so rather than carry it and walk hundreds of miles to do this in the freezing cold of Antarctica, we put it on a Nansen sled. This is a sled made of wood, no ferrous metals on it, so it's not going to affect our magnetometer. And here is my assistant, Aaron Froley, and my collaborator, Mike Walker from the University of Auckland. They're both very happy because it's their first time in Antarctica. But Aaron didn't realize that this is how we do the surveys. No, I'm kidding, actually. We do put them on a vehicle and tow them far behind our iron horse. And we spent a whole lot of time on this vehicle, traveling hundreds of miles at 10 miles an hour to create a map. So this is the map that we created. The colored area here is our map of the Earth's magnetic field in the area that we surveyed. And we actually surveyed about 4 different areas here before we found a place that we could work. And the actual site that we're working in is shown here in close-up. So what you're looking at here is a magnetic map of the area where that sea ice is. And the colors represent the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. But more important than the intensity are the lines that you see on this. These are lines of equal intensity. And so we're looking for the orientation of those field lines, and we're looking for them to be different. So we chose Camp 1 here, where you see the field lines are roughly running in this direction, sort of a 45-degree angle, right? And then Camp 2, where they're running at about a 90-degree angle, that is horizontally. And then Camp 3, where there's no apparent directionality. It's basically flat. There's not much change at all. So we have 3 different expectations. In Camp 1, the seal's structures, contouring structures, those jagged things, should be roughly at a 45-degree angle. Turns out to be about 47 degrees in that particular location. At Camp 2, they should be roughly 90 degrees. And at Camp 3, we shouldn't see any particular orientation whatsoever. So it's a really rigorous test of that hypothesis. The next thing we have to do is to build a camp where in each of these locations. And it's not easy work. We have to drill 6 holes, 2 holes at each location, at each campsite. Fortunately, we have heavy equipment to do that work. Then we drag a hut, a plywood hut, over top of the hole that we drilled, over one of the holes that we drilled. And it has a trap door in the bottom of the hut that's centered over that hole. So you'll see here is the trap door in the hut and the hole right below it. And so we can work inside that hut with the seal. The seal can breathe in that hut. He can't get out because the hut is elevated above the sea ice. So that basically the seal just breathes in that hole. And when we're done and we want to recover the seal, there's another hole outside of the hut that's plugged. But when we're ready to retrieve the seal, we take the plug off of the hole and the seal pops out because he's ready to get out of the water. So next thing to do is to catch a seal. We have to do this very carefully. They're very docile animals, so there is not much danger to us unless you get in front of the teeth. But we also want to be very careful not to harm the animal in any way whatsoever. And so it takes quite a few people. You'll see that I and my collaborator are here with this vinyl bag. And then another 2 members of our party are here with a net. First thing we do is we take the bag and we put it over the seal's head. Now there's an opening in the end so the seal can still breathe, but we're protecting his eyes and we're also calming him down by being in darkness. So we put the bag over his head, which isn't as easy as it sounds. And then while he's in there in that nice calm state, we take the purse seine net and we wrap it around him, and then we can tow him with the vehicle into a sled, very short distance, close the door on the sled, take him out of the mesh, take the bag off his head, and then we transport him to where we need him. And so it's really, we've done this for 20 years and it's never lost a seal, never harmed a seal as far as we can tell. And it's worked out very well for us. So then next thing we do is we get him inside the hut. Here you can see the hut and you can see the trap door at the bottom. We dress the seal, we call it, we dress the seal where we put the instruments on the seal. You can see there's still the bag on the head to keep the animal calm. We have the main instrument. I seem to have lost track of this thing. Okay, so we've got the main instrument that's going to go on the head of the seal, but we have on the back of the seal some satellite transmitters so that if the seal gets out and gets away from us when we're not there, we can find him again, and some battery packs. So it's really a relatively minimal amount of equipment on the seal, and we found that it doesn't add any energy cost to the animal swimming. So it's pretty innocuous. And like I said, we've been doing this for quite a long time and the results seem to work out quite well. So there's the animal getting ready to go into the hole, and then next to it is the seal looking up at us after we've put them in the water. So I seem to have lost control. I'll just go to manual control. Manual override. No, that's not working either. Wow, we're frozen. Huh.
It all started back on.
Yeah. I didn't try that. Oh, there you go. Thank you. Let's see if anything else works. Okay, so after we deploy the animal into the water, the next step is to recapture the animal after a few days. Take the equipment off the animal, download the data, put the equipment back on the animal, transport it to the next hut, put them inside, drop them in the water, 3 days, rinse and repeat, do it 3 times. So each seal, we did 10 seals. We do each seal in each of the 3 huts, collect a lot of data, and then analyze the data. So just to refresh your memories, when it comes to testing our hypothesis about the geomagnetic navigation, we're looking for contouring structures, the little jagged marks, jagged trails in the path, and we're expecting them to be aligned with the magnetic field at that campsite. So what do the data look like? Here's a summary. Firstly, you'll see the map, the geomagnetic map, just to remind you that we're looking for this angle here, 90 degrees here, and nothing over at campsite 3. And then the results are in these 3 charts. Let me explain the charts a little bit slowly for you. These are histograms. It shows you how many structures, contouring structures that we found are going in a particular direction. So let's start over here, in this panel here. So here we have the largest number of structures are oriented at about 10 degrees. And there's some more over at 20, and there's some down here at about 35, and there's some over here at 60. And that's just showing you the number of structures that are in a particular direction. And I think you can see in that panel C that there's no particular direction to these structures, which is exactly what we predicted for campsite 3. Remember, campsite 3 has no orientation of the magnetic field. It's pretty flat. So we expect that the seals are not going in any particular direction, and that's what we found. At campsite A, for instance, we expect a 45-degree angle. In fact, I put on the axis here a little arrow what we expect. It turns out it's 47 degrees. So we expect them to be in this direction. And you'll notice that's absolutely not what we found. Most of them are going at about 5 degrees, but there's a whole nother group going at about 55 degrees. It's not what we found, not what we expected at all. And at site 2, campsite 2, we're expecting about 85 degrees, 86 degrees, and they're going at 15 degrees. So didn't work. So the conclusion is we can't support that hypothesis. There's no evidence that they're using a geomagnetic sense in this manner at this location and time. 1 down. Next hypothesis was path integration. Remember, path integration is a straight line back to the hole. Remember I said ants and bees and hamsters do it? Maybe that's what they mean by a beeline. Yeah. So the expectation is that they go straight back to the hole. Now, we calculated how straight the outbound leg was and how straight the inbound leg was simply by dividing the total distance that they traveled by the net distance that they traveled. If they go along a straight line, then the answer would be 1. If they did any kinds of movements away from a straight line, they'd have a lower number. So if you take a look, and that's what we're calling path linearity, okay? So both of these axes here, the y-axis, the vertical axes, are path linearity, and a value of 1 would be a straight line. Now, we have 4 different dive types I haven't told you about. Basically, think of them as feeding dives, type 1. Feeding dives are very deep dives. They don't go very far from the hole. They just go straight down and they look for fish, and then it comes straight back up. That's not really a challenge for a seal to find his way home, because all he has to do is look up and see the hole. But if he goes a long distance, he can't see the hole because he's too far away. Okay, so that's a type 4 dive. Type 2 dive is a short dive, type 3 dive is a medium dive, and type 4 is a long dive. And what I mean by a long dive is a half a mile to a mile away, one way. Okay, so we're really interested in type 4 dives. Take a look at the results here. Type 4 dives, outbound leg, a little less linear than the inbound leg, and the inbound leg is very linear. The difference between the two is shown here. So bottom line here is, yeah, it looks like they might be using path integration because their return paths tend to be very straight. Not a particularly rigorous test, but that's all we have for path integration. Then there's that hydrodynamic trail following hypothesis that I told you about. where the seals might be turning around and sensing their own wake and following that to go back. That would suggest that they would have the distant portions of their outbound leg and their inbound leg would be on top of one another, or at least very close. Based on the size of the animals and based on the water conditions, we would expect that they should be able to sense their own trail if they were within 30 feet of their trail. That's what close is in the scale of these animals. And so we measured what was the minimum distance between the outbound leg and inbound leg at the far end. And we found on average, it was about 234 feet. The closest they ever came in any single dive was 36 feet. That's more than 30 feet. And 234 is certainly more than 30 feet. So we don't have any support for that hypothesis. Too bad. It was a really cool idea. And then finally, we have piloting. Now, you remember piloting, we had a lot of different things to look for that might support or at least test for piloting. There should be a learning period once they're released into the hull where they're learning the local navigation landmarks. So here are some characteristics of the dives that occur before the first long distance dive. Remember, they should need, if they're using piloting, they should need landmarks to come back from a long distance dive. And they should be taking time to learn those landmarks. So we find that on average, there were 16 dives before the first long distance dive. That's encouraging. The shortest number of dives, the smallest number of dives before the first long distance dive was 6. So these animals are spending some time diving before they go a long distance. How far did they go in that period they were doing short dives before they went on their first long dive? On average, about 800 feet. And the longest they ever went was 2,500 feet. That was a pretty long dive. And then the longest dive, the mean distance they went on the first long distance dive was 3,600 feet. So when they do start to dive long, they go long. And before that, they're generally pretty short. So we would say that's some evidence that this might be what they're doing. They might be piloting. At least we have one bit of evidence for that. Second one is they should have progressively longer dives. That is, they learn the local landmarks, then they go a little bit further, learn those landmarks, then they go a little bit further and so forth. So here's a series of dives here in the same direction, shown here. So dive number 12, dive 24, dive 85, and dive 134. So these are in sequence, and you'll notice that along this particular route that the animals were swimming, the dives got progressively longer. And we saw this in several cases. So again, we see they might be using piloting because there's this expectation is being met. Another expectation was that the inbound paths, when they return from their far point, they should converge on a small number of highways, if you will, a number of paths that are marked by landmarks. So what we're looking at here are the 3 different campsites, 1, 2, and 3 from left to right, and the frequency with which they entered a particular square in that space, right? So these spaces go about 1,500 to 2,000 meters on either side of the hole. And the redder the color, the more times they went through that particular square. It's basically showing you traffic patterns. And I think you can see that in each hole, there are some reliable, frequently used traffic patterns. Again, some indication that they're using piloting. Okay. And then the final expectation that we had is that if they don't turn around and go directly home, they might go to a highway and then go home. And so here's an example of exactly that. Here you see a series of dives by the same seal. And in all but one of these cases, the seal did not turn around and go home, but went in some other direction. So you'll see that the outbound paths are in blue, and then they go in some other direction, and then they turn home. Here he's going in an outbound direction, goes in some other direction, then goes home. And this happens in all but one of these cases. This case over here is one where he just went right back home. So there's some indication that they are following that expectation of navigation by landmarks. So what landmarks are they using? So we, on top of the ice, use landmarks, right? You can see these tracks here because we use a narrow path to go from one campsite to another when we're moving the seals around. We want to, go minimize our disturbance and go down particular paths. And we sometimes have very little visibility, much less than you see here. And that's why you see these red flags spaced so close together. If our visibility is only down to 50 feet, we can still go because we can see a flag that's 50 feet away. And we are piloting. We're piloting by those red flags. Those are our landmarks. But what are the SEALs using? So here's our campsite again. The blue lines connecting the three camps are the roads that we've paved on the snow, just like the one you just saw with the flags on it. Okay, it's just tracked down snow, right? And then what we did is we mapped those SEALs paths, the return paths, on top of our paths, and you'll notice something pretty remarkable. The SEALs were swimming right underneath our roads. The upper one are the roads that we created, and the SEALs were returning to their holes underneath our roads. Now, in a couple of cases, when we finished with a particular SEAL and we wanted to take them back to where we caught them, to release them and say, okay, goodbye, thank you for your contribution, we didn't take our roads, we made new roads. So we made this road here, and we made this road here. And what do you know? The SEALs are swimming underneath our roads. So we think that the SEALs can see something under the ice that was created by our roads. We think they're navigating by roads that we made on top of the ice. So what did we learn? Geomagnetic navigation hypothesis was not supported. Hydrodynamic trail following, as cool as it is, not supported. Path integration, yeah, it's supported, but that finding is also common to other techniques of navigation like piloting. But there's a lot of evidence, really strong evidence, for piloting by overhead visual cues. So that's what we learned. This is the team that did the work in one of the years. The three researchers are shown down here in the bottom. Dr. Randall Davis from Texas A&M University in Galveston. Dr. Terry Williams from the University of California at Santa Cruz, yours truly. And we have 4 of our field assistants for this particular year. We require this many people in the field every time we do this project, and we rotate out people as needed. And of course, the research is supported by the National Science Foundation with grants to each of our 3 institutions, as well as very good support from the U.S. Antarctic program, shown here, who helps with us with all the logistics. So I want to thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
Do the SEALs keep their holes open year-round so they do have access to the ice, or do they periodically move to another one?
Both. So as I explained to you, the sea ice, the amount of sea ice changes throughout the season. So at some times of year, there's, depending on where they are, there could be very little, and they'll be at the mercy of orca and things like that. So they don't have an ice to keep open. However, for shorter periods of time, like say in the spring, summer, spring, winter, and fall, there's plenty of ice around them, and it can get cold enough that the cracks will freeze, right? And they could potentially not survive. So I just happen to have a slide that might help you understand that. These guys are incredibly well designed to. I was going to show you how we got there and what the place looks like. But this is what I wanted to show you. So first of all, this is the skull of a Weddell seal, and you'll notice it has big teeth, and that those teeth are pointed forward. So the teeth, of course, are for chewing on food, but they also use them to keep their holes open. And so there's a very nice little video here on YouTube from David Attenborough that explains that whole process to you.
and they keep their breathing holes open with their teeth. Only by continually scraping away at the ice can they maintain access to the air.
I didn't plant that question, honestly. And they do move from places. Some of them do migrate in the winter time. Sorry, in the springtime, they'll migrate from more northern locations down, more northern locations down to southern locations, and then they'll migrate back. But not all of them do. There was a question further back.
How do you attach the equipment?
Yes, how do we attach the equipment to the seals? Great question. I always get that one. We don't want to harm the animals, of course, because we're trying to study behavior and we want the behavior to be as natural as possible when you have a camera on your head and some batteries on your back. So the way we do it is we have neoprene, like wetsuit material, and into that material is sewn some fittings that allow us to attach our equipment. So really all we have to do is attach the neoprene, the rubber, to the seals. Now rubber is of course very flexible, so we're not harming the movement of the seals as they're trying to swim, and we attach it with a neoprene cement. So basically we paint the fur with cement, we press the neoprene on there, and then we allow it to dry. And after we dress the animal, we wait 8 hours before we release him anyhow, just to make sure the animal's healthy. Now, that doesn't harm the animal, and when the animal molts in the springtime, it comes off. There you go.
How much do those seals weigh?
Between 800 and 1,000 pounds would be a big adult. Females are larger than males for the most part, the ones that we work with. Question in the back there, ma'am.
The seal comes on a track and has an air hole. If you don't have a road around there, are there other naturally occurring, like you showed a pile kind of a snow on that one slide, are there other naturally occurring things that they can see from underneath that they can guide themselves up?
Right. So the question is, are there naturally occurring landmarks that seals could use underwater to navigate back to a naturally occurring hole? Great question. And had we not found the unfortunate circumstance that we created the landmarks for the seals, that's exactly the question we were hoping to address. And that remains an open question. But given that they were able to use the holes, the landmarks that we accidentally created just at the time that they were in the holes, one can assume that they can follow other features that are naturally occurring. So for instance, if a snowdrift forms, say a ridge of snow that's elevated, that's going to be less light getting through. So it might appear as a darker region under the ice that they could then use. The crack itself will be a feature they could see. However, those tend to go parallel to the shoreline rather than out into the deeper water. So if they happen to go out into deep water, they would have to use something else to find their way back. Yes, sir.
So when we were in the Antarctica, we saw tons of seals on icebergs. We never saw any in the water. And there was a lot of orcas. So are they able to sense the orcas are in the area, I guess, or do they migrate through? Or
Well,
I never saw any in the water.
Yeah, but I would ask you, how would you see them in the water? They wouldn't be at the surface. There's no reason for them to be at the surface.
Okay, so so if they went off
when they dive,
straight down.
they go down, because what they're doing is they're looking for fish, and the fish they're looking for are not at the surface. So they would go straight down, and so if they were there, you wouldn't see them.
Okay. We see penguins, up on the iceberg and then in the water as well, but never seals up. I was curious about that.
Yeah, so now if they were migrating, they might be at the surface or might be near the surface. But the Weddell seals probably wouldn't be migrating. Elephant seals, actually, that's not true. Yeah, elephant seals are really, really good migrators, but they migrate at deep depths. So you're not going to see seals the only time you're going to see seals is when they're on the ice. Yeah. Over here.
Did you have daytime and nighttime dive data that you shared and seeing interesting?
Yeah, I was a little worried that I wasn't going to fit everything I wanted to say in a reasonable time, and so I didn't tell you about that. But in fact, yes, we did this over 3 field seasons, and in one field season we concentrated on the springtime after sunrise. Okay, so there's a date at which the sun comes above the horizon in Antarctica, and it's there for the whole day. And there's a date earlier in August when it never comes above the horizon, it's down all day. And then there's a period where we have both a day and a night, okay, a sunrise and a sunset. We can't get there to do this work and build the camp before the first sunrise. But we do go down there in that period where you have sunrise and sunset. So in the first year, we went in the springtime when there was 24 hours of sunlight. And the second season, we went during the period where you had both sunrise and sunset, so that we could then study the behavior when the sun was below the horizon. And the data were in the slides, but you may not have seen them. I think on the slide where I showed them swimming under our roads, there were two different colors of paths along there. The one that you saw fewer of that was, I think, reddish color, were the nighttime dives. And they also went underneath the roads. Now, nighttime at that time of year is like twilight. It's not dark, right? So the sun is below the horizon, but it's still dim out. Okay, so we didn't have total darkness. Yes, sir.
The time of total darkness, how do they see their landmarks? I mean, I'm assuming their visual processes are similar to ours.
Well, they're similar in terms of how they see, but they're much, much better at seeing. So they have much bigger eyeballs for their body size. They have much bigger pupils, so they can let a lot more light in. Now, inside your pupil is your retina, and it has these sensors called photoreceptors, which are what we see by. And a certain kind of photoreceptor called a rod cell is what we see at night. They have many, many, many more rod cells than we have, so they're again more sensitive. And then inside each of those cells is a chemical that is triggered by light to create what we see as vision, and they have much more of that chemical in their cells. So they are thousands of times more sensitive to light than we are. Still, if there's no light, it doesn't matter how sensitive you are. And so we don't know what they do when it's wintertime and new moon, so there's no light whatsoever. We don't know the answer to that. In fact, the paper that we published on this, the last paragraph is, despite everything that we've just told you, we don't know how they do this in the wintertime. That's the next question in this field. Yes, sir.
They're suggesting that they always return to the same spot where they do what they last had to go. If that wasn't available, would you find one of your other camps of previous camps?
So the design of our experiment was intended to set those holes far enough apart that they couldn't possibly get from one to the other. I'm sorry? Yeah, they were 1.5 miles. That was our estimate at how far they could travel. And we thought we cushioned it enough. It turns out we didn't cushion it enough for one of the seals who actually went from one hole to the other. And that did happen. Wasn't supposed to happen, but it did happen. That's, you know, you give them your best guess. So they would have to find a place to breathe, otherwise they would die. And we've been doing these experiments for 20 years and we've never lost a seal. So it's they always find their way back to the breathing hole they came from. Now, I will say that 82-minute dive that we recorded, remember I told you at the start, the longest dive we recorded is 82 minutes. We thought the longest they could go was about 45 minutes, and we were really worried. And then the seal showed up at 45 and took the biggest breaths you ever saw. Yes, ma'am.
Where do they migrate?
So we work with a population in McMurdo Sound, and that population is extremely well studied, probably the best studied population of Weddell seals in the world, maybe the best studied population of any seal. We don't study their migration, but from my understanding of that group's research over the past several decades, is they go from McMurdo Sound north. They really can't go south because McMurdo Station is located at the edge of what's called the permanent ice edge or the permanent ice shelf, part of the ice that never melts. That's where the great explorers of the heroic age sailed their ships and then got off and set their camp, like Scott and Amundsen and so forth. That's as far south as you could go, because that's as far as the that's as far as the ice would melt. That may not be so true in the coming years, but that's where it is. So they couldn't go south because the ice below there is tens of meters thick. There are no cracks, no way for them to breathe. So they have to go north. Where do they go north? They go up along the coast and probably following food availability. So in the summertime, when the ice edge retreats, they can go up there and get more food up in those more northern locations. Yes, sir.
Now, seals, are you and the other scientists with them, are they like buried, or how do you get food? You take all your years, food, contain access.
Let's see if I have a picture for that one. No, hold on. So McMurdo Station is the largest base that the U.S. has in Antarctica. There's a picture of it. I've never been to a mining town, but I think that's what a mining town probably looks like. It's on Ross Island. It's a volcanic island. There's of course no plants there, and a lot of sheet metal buildings. There's a set of buildings. You see this brownish building over here. That's actually a series of buildings. They're 3 stories high. That's dormitories. There's a cafeteria. There's recreation. There's all sorts of shops. I mean, it's a town, and at peak season there can be 1,000 to 1,200 people there. Out of that 1,000 to 1,200 people, there's probably only 200 or 300 scientists. The rest are support staff. So the crew that comes out and builds our camp are the support staff. There's search and rescue people. There's physicians. There's, it's everything you need to survive separated from the rest of the world, and no easy way to get to the rest of the world. And it's a temporary situation. That peak season with about 1,000 people is January, which is midsummer. They start sending people down in the end of August when they can first get flights down there, and they take them off the ice in February. Now, there is a residual crew of about 100 to 125 people that stay there all year round for about 1 year before they go nuts and they take them off. I'm just kidding, but so the population there can be quite large. It's actually a great place for scientists to do research, because it's there for that reason only. Yes.
This for the geometric
Hypothesis.
But the pole moves slightly, does it not? And so geomagnetic field would vary slightly too.
Correct.
As the force moves. So would that have an effect on the not following the geomagnetic distance?
So the movement of the Earth's magnetic field is very, very, very slow, and there's no way possible. Even we can measure, at least we biologists can measure the change during the course of a 20-minute dive. It doesn't move that much in 20 minutes, right? So for the seal, from the seal's point of view, it shouldn't matter. Now, for our research point of view, it does matter, because we went down there in 3 consecutive years, and so the field that we measured in 1 year might be slightly different than the field in the next year. And so we did redo our portions of our survey each year just to calibrate it, to adjust it from year to year to make sure that we knew what the seals were experiencing. Okay. Any other questions? I see one over there.
Do the seals have a certain sleep pattern?
Yeah, they sleep a lot on top of the ice. That's how we're able to catch them. No, they don't seem to. They just sort of come out of the water and they get on top of the ice and roll over and sleep. And then we go and put a bag on their head and a net on them. Other questions? Yes, sir.
The mammals have the ability to sense salinity and temperature. Have they been discounted as a way of navigation?
In this case, it wouldn't work, because the salinity is pretty constant, and the temperature is absolutely constant. It's minus 1.8 degrees centigrade everywhere underneath the ice. Yes, sir.
What effect do you have for studying females that are giving birth to pups? I don't know how long, not to stay with the mother, but how the pups going to be?
Okay, are you asking me the effect of our research on the seals that are giving birth, or are you asking how seals train their pups?
Correct.
Okay, I haven't studied that myself, but I've observed it. So they give birth in January, February, and you can see the cute little pups on the ice, and the mothers just sort of teach them. They take them over to the crack, and they go in and they learn, and then they come out, and it's just, I don't know the details of it, but it happens like that. Yes, ma'am.
With that, then, are they territorial?
Are seals territorial? Well, yes and no. They're not territorial with regard to the space on top of the ice where they kind of hang out. But breathing holes are very scarce. And so when they are in a breathing hole, if there's another seal coming, the one in the hole is going to protect himself or to defend the breathing hole, but the one that's coming really needs to breathe, and so they're often big fights. So you may have noticed on the video I showed before I started speaking, there was an interaction between two seals, and there was a lot of chirping from one seal. He was basically saying, get away, and the other one said, no, I gotta breathe, and they actually fight. And there's often in one of my first slides also, when I showed you the sea ice with the seals and along the shoreline, you might have seen some red spots. Well, that's blood. They draw blood on each other when they're fighting to get to those breathing holes. As you can imagine, it's pretty important for a seal that's just been holding his breath for 20 minutes to breathe. So they do defend the holes, but that's about the extent of the defense that I'm familiar with. Yes, sir.
Why did you pick the window seal and not the leopard seal?
Because I like my fingers and toes. Leopard seals are very vicious predators. Whale seals are not.
Are they in the same area?
Yes. No, we don't. I think we generally see maybe one leopard seal a year. So they're not very common, but the Weddell seals are all over the place. Okay, one last question. No last questions. Okay, there it is.
I despise cold. How do they insulate those buildings?
Oh, there's a lot of heat down there. I don't know about the insulation. There has to be insulation, but you're never cold inside. Yeah, they burn a lot of fuel down there. Speaking of burning fuel, here's a cute little tidbit. Well, the first year I went down there in 1997, there were some researchers who had been there for a long time studying psychology and physiology of the workers, of the 1,000 people that are down there, and especially the workers who are out in the elements rather than the cafeteria workers or the indoor workers. They learned that in order to maintain your body weight, a human being who's working outdoors in Antarctica has to eat about 3 times the total calories that they eat normally, just to maintain their body weight. That may explain why the cafeteria down there, or the galley as we refer to it, has all you can eat all day long. And I had gained more weight in the first year than I've ever gained in my entire life. I guess I wasn't outside enough. After that, I learned not to eat so much. Okay, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate your questions. Hope you enjoyed it.